Gina Emmanuel, what does safety look like? For most children, it is a warm bed, a full plate, and someone who cares when they are hurt. For three sisters in Miami, safety was supposed to come in the form of adoption, a registered nurse, a stable home, and a promise that they would never be separated. But what happens when the person meant to protect you becomes the one you need protection from? Gina Emmanuel was 56 years old when she stood in a Miami courtroom in April 2025, emotionless, as a jury convicted her of first-degree premeditated murder and aggravated abuse of two other young girls. The case had taken years to reach trial, delayed by legal backlogs and the pandemic. But when it finally arrived, the world learned what had been hidden behind closed doors on West Dixie Highway in Northeast Miami-Dade. This was not a story of accidental neglect or a parent overwhelmed by circumstances. This was deliberate, calculated, and it ended with a 7-year-old girl named Samaya losing her life. Emmanuel began fostering the children in 2014. In 2017, she formally adopted 3 sisters and their 4-year-old brother. On paper, it seemed ideal. The sisters, aged 12, 7, and 6 at the time of adoption, would stay together. That alone was rare in foster care, where siblings are often separated due to limited placements. Emmanuel appeared responsible. She had a nursing license, a steady income, and the willingness to take on multiple children. Foster care workers praised her background. The system trusted her. The children had no choice but to do the same. But trust, once broken, leaves scars that never fully heal. What should have been a new beginning became a living nightmare. Inside Emmanuel's home, the girls faced conditions prosecutors later described as horrific. They were chained. Food was locked away. They were forced to use a bucket as a toilet. They were whipped with belts. Access to school and medical care was denied. And when they made mistakes, even small ones, the consequences were brutal. One incident stood out during the trial. Emmanuel became enraged when 2 of the girls took bread mint for her biological adult son. She woke the 12-year-old sister so she could watch as punishment was carried out. Emmanuel then held the 6-year-old's and 7-year-old's hands down on a hot stove, burning them repeatedly. Their hands were permanently scarred. These were not accidents or moments of frustration. This was control through pain. Soon after, Samaya became sick. The 7-year-old began showing flu-like symptoms, but Emmanuel, a trained nurse who understood illness, did not seek medical attention. Days passed, and Samaya's condition worsened. She coughed, fainted, and struggled to walk. A caretaker for Emmanuel's biological son, who had special needs, witnessed Samaya lying down as if she were having a seizure. The caretaker called Emmanuel and warned her that the child was in very bad condition. Emmanuel did not return home until hours later. On November 3, 2018, Samaya was found unresponsive. She died hours later at the hospital. The cause of death was determined to be pneumonia and sepsis resulting from an untreated illness. An autopsy revealed the full extent of her suffering. Healed whip-like marks covered her body. Burns scarred her hands. Gaping wounds on her knees and hands had gone untreated, injuries that would have required specialized medical care. Samaya had been living in agony, and the person responsible for her care had done nothing. Investigators began piecing together the truth. Homicide detectives noticed suspicious injuries during the initial examination. 2 days after Samaya's death, the remaining sisters were examined by child protection specialists. Numerous injuries from past abuse were found, including healed marks and burn scars. The girls were removed from Emmanuel's home, and their testimonies became the foundation of the prosecution's case. The trial began in April 2025. Ayanna Gordon, now 18 and one of Emmanuel's adopted daughters, testified about the repeated abuse she and her sisters endured. She described starvation, being forced to stand on one leg for hours, being taped to chairs, and being denied basic human needs. Her voice cracked, but she did not falter. She told the truth. Emmanuel's defense argued there was no credible evidence she had caused the harm, suggesting the situation was a tragic accident rather than intentional cruelty. The jury disagreed. After just 1 hour of deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Emmanuel showed no emotion that on April 30th, 2025, a Miami-Dade Circuit Court judge sentenced Emmanuel to life in prison plus 30 years for the abuse of the surviving children, to be served concurrently. In the courtroom, Ayanna faced her former guardian one final time. "I'm letting God take this wheel," she said. "With that now said, I wish you well in hell." Samaya's visually impaired grandfather also addressed Emmanuel. He said he forgave her, but could never forget what she had done to his grandchildren. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. Gina Emmanuel will never walk free again. Her nursing license was revoked, her reputation destroyed. But for the surviving sisters, the damage runs deeper than any courtroom verdict can repair. Trauma does not disappear with justice. Therapy helps, support helps, but the memory of that house and of Samaya's absence will follow them for the rest of their lives. This case raises uncomfortable questions. How did Emmanuel pass every background check? How did the system place vulnerable children in her care? And how many other children are still living behind doors no one thinks to open? The answers matter, because Samaya's story should not have ended this way. She deserved better. They all did. Case number 2, Phenecia Scott. What sound does a mother's love make? For most children, it is laughter during playtime, whispered bedtime stories, and soft reassurances when the world feels frightening. But for 16-month-old Rhythm Fields, silence became the only escape. Her name promised music. Her life delivered only pain. And when she was finally found cold and still in a Washington, D.C. apartment, one question echoed above all others. How long had she been suffering? On March 21, 2017, Phenecia Scott's friend, who was also Rhythm's godmother, arrived at Scott's apartment on C Street Southeast. It was an ordinary afternoon. The godmother's 8-year-old child wanted to play with Rhythm. Scott then discovered Rhythm in her playpen, unresponsive and cold. Panic, real or performed, took over. Scott ran outside and flagged down a mail carrier for help. The mail carrier called emergency services and followed Scott back into the apartment, where Rhythm lay lifeless on the couch. Her body was cold, stiff, and her eyes were fixed. 2 other individuals attempted CPR, including an experienced former firefighter, but it was far too late. Rhythm had been gone for hours. Scott told first responders she had not checked on her daughter for several hours before finding her dead. That admission alone raised alarm. What parent does not check on a 16-month-old for hours? The answer emerged during the autopsy. On March 22, 2017, the medical examiner examined Rhythm's body. Nearly a year later, the manner of death was ruled intentional abuse, and the cause of death was determined to be multiple blunt force injuries. The findings were devastating. Rhythm suffered contusions and abrasions to her head, neck, torso, and limbs, bleeding in and around the brain, swelling of the brain, oxygen deprivation, hemorrhaging in her eyes, and 23 fractured ribs. 23. There was evidence of both healing and fresh fractures, indicating repeated abuse over time. This was not a single moment of rage. This was a pattern of sustained violence. What sound does a mother's love make? For most children, it's laughter during playtime, whispered bedtime stories, soft reassurances when the world feels scary. But for 16-month-old Rhythm Fields, silence became the only escape. Her name promised music. Her life delivered only pain. And when she was finally found, cold and still in a Washington, D.C. apartment, the question everyone asked was simple. How long had she been suffering? On March 21, 2017, Phenecia Scott's friend, who was Rhythm's godmother, arrived at Scott's home in the 5400 block of C Street, Southeast. It was an ordinary afternoon. The friend's 8-year-old child wanted to play with Rhythm. Scott then found Rhythm in her playpen, unresponsive and cold. Panic, real or performed, took over. Scott ran outside, flagging down a mail carrier for help. The mail carrier called 911 and followed Scott back to the apartment, where they observed Rhythm on the couch, lifeless. The child's body was cold, her body was stiff, and her eyes were fixed. 2 other individuals entered the residence to administer CPR, including an experienced former firefighter. But it was too late. Rhythm had been gone for hours. The mother told first responders that she hadn't had contact with her daughter for hours before she was found dead. That admission alone raised red flags. What mother doesn't check on a 16-month-old for hours? The answer came when the D.C. Medical Examiner's Office began their work. On March 22, 2017, an autopsy was performed on Rhythm's remains. On February 5, 2018, they ruled the manner of death was intentional harm and the cause of death was multiple blunt force injuries. The findings were devastating. The blunt force injuries included contusions and abrasions of the head, neck, torso, and extremities, subdural hemorrhage, cerebral edema, subarachnoid hemorrhage and acute oxygen deprivation, retinal and optic nerve sheath hemorrhage, and 23 bilateral rib fractures. 23. Let that number sit. There was evidence of both healing and new rib fractures, indicating repeated harm over time. This wasn't a single moment of rage. This was a pattern. Rhythm had been enduring violence for weeks, maybe months. Her tiny body had been breaking slowly, and no one intervened. No one stopped it. During the investigation, Scott told a Metropolitan Police Department detective that she gave her daughter adult cold syrup containing dextromethorphan, which was not age-appropriate. Instructions on a cough medicine bottle similar to the one administered to the child state: do not give to children under age 12. A sippy cup found on the scene was forensically examined by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration and was found to contain dextromethorphan. Scott wasn't just physically harming Rhythm. She was sedating her, keeping her quiet, keeping her compliant. The case took years to reach trial. Legal backlogs, the pandemic, and the complexity of the investigation all contributed. But in June 2025, Phanecia Scott finally faced a jury. In opening statements, the prosecution said Fields sustained injuries consistent with being shaken and struck with an object and had healing bone fractures. They added that cough syrup was allegedly found both at the scene and in Fields' system. Prosecutors played a video interview in which Scott admitted to shaking her daughter in an attempt to stop her from crying to Scott's former best friend, and Fields' godmother testified that she disapproved of Scott's parenting style, including allegedly beating her children. The prosecution was careful in their framing. Chose neglect over nurture and harm over help, they asserted. They emphasized they were not shaming a young mother facing homelessness while raising 3 children, but contended that Scott deliberately took actions that resulted in Fields' passing. Poverty is not an excuse for violence. Stress is not permission to hurt. Prosecutors highlighted the medical examiner's testimony, in which they stated the cause of death was multiple blunt force traumas and the manner of death intentional harm. The prosecution reminded the jury that Scott held sole custody of, and thus, complete responsibility for Rhythm. There was no one else to blame. No mysterious intruder. No accident. Just a mother and a child, alone in an apartment where one of them didn't survive. Scott was found guilty by a jury on June 11th of first-degree cruelty to children, first-degree intentional harm with aggravating circumstances, and second-degree cruelty to children. The verdict came swiftly. The evidence was overwhelming. The Honorable Jason Park scheduled sentencing for August 29th, 2025. On October 24th, she was sentenced to 41 years in prison. 41 years. Rhythm Fields lived for 16 months. Scott will spend decades behind bars. Is that justice? Is that enough? For some, no amount of time will ever feel adequate. For others, it's a small measure of accountability in a case that defies comprehension. But the real tragedy isn't just what happened to Rhythm. It's what didn't happen. No teacher noticed bruises because Rhythm wasn't in school. No doctor raised concerns because Scott avoided medical appointments. No neighbor heard screams because apartments have thick walls and people mind their business. Rhythm fell through every crack in the system designed to protect children like her. She was invisible until she was gone. Phanecia Scott will be eligible for release when she's in her 70s, assuming she serves her full sentence. By then, Rhythm would have been middle-aged. She might have had children of her own, a career, dreams, a life filled with the music her name promised. Instead, she's a statistic, a news headline, a cautionary tale about what happens when we look away. The questions linger. Could Rhythm have been saved? Would her warning signs people missed or ignored? And how many other children are living in similar silence right now, waiting for someone to notice? The answers matter because Rhythm Fields deserved better. She deserved safety. She deserved love. She deserved to grow up. Case 3 Dahbia Benkired Trust is supposed to flow naturally between neighbors. A borrowed cup of sugar, help carrying groceries, small kindnesses that bind communities together. But what happens when someone uses that familiarity as a weapon? When a simple request for help becomes the last decision a child ever makes. On October 14th, 2022, 12-year-old Lola Daviet learned the answer to that question, and Paris would never forget her name. Lola Daviet was born on August 18th, 2010 in Bethune. She was a pupil at the College Georges Brassens in Paris and was a champion in aerobics. She lived with her parents, Johan and Delphine, in a residential building in the 19th arrondissement of northeastern Paris. Her parents worked as caretakers for the building, which meant Lola knew the hallways, the tenants, the rhythms of home. It was supposed to be safe, familiar, a place where nothing bad could happen. On October 14th, 2022, at about 4:30 in the afternoon, Johan Daviet, after his daughter failed to return home from school, reported to a police station that Lola Daviet was missing. The search began immediately. Authorities checked security footage. Neighbors were questioned. Every parent's worst nightmare was unfolding in real time. And then, just hours later, the discovery. Lola's body was found mutilated and stuffed into a plastic box in a communal area outside the building she lived in. It was subsequently established that she had been abducted, raped, and murdered, her cause of death being asphyxiation. Daviet had over 30 stab wounds and other visible signs of injury. The autopsy revealed a level of violence that defied comprehension. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was calculated, sadistic, evil. The perpetrator, Dahbia Benkired, was recorded by a CCTV circuit leaving the building in the afternoon carrying heavy luggage, which included the suitcase holding the victim's body. Surveillance footage doesn't lie. The evidence was irrefutable. After receiving witness reports and analyzing video surveillance footage, authorities tracked down the now 27-year-old Dahbia Benkired, an Algerian woman living in France under a deportation order, and arrested her on the same day Daviet's body was discovered. Born in Algiers, Algeria, Benkired had come to France legally, in May 2016, on a student visa, which she then overstayed. She had no prior criminal record and was known to the police as a victim of domestic violence, committed in 2018. Benkired was unemployed and lived with an acquaintance in Val-de-Marne or with her 26-year-old sister in the same apartment building in Paris as the Daviet family. The proximity was chilling. Lola's mother, the building's caretaker, had even interacted with Benkired. Lola's mother had rejected Benkired's request for a pass that would enable her to enter the apartment on her own. Was that rejection the catalyst? Did Benkired harbor resentment that eventually exploded into violence? In October 2022, Benkired was living with her sister upstairs in Daviet's building while illegally in France under a deportation order. When Daviet was coming home from school, Benkired asked if she could help her with her suitcases. It seemed harmless, a neighbor needing assistance. Daviet said she had been instructed not to go into strangers' homes, but Benkired insisted and lured her into her sister's apartment. Lola's caution was overridden by politeness, by the desire to help, by the assumption that someone living in her own building couldn't possibly be dangerous. Over the hour and a half that followed, Benkired asked Daviet to take a shower before assaulting and raping her. Then, she taped her mouth and nose shut, forcing her to suffocate. She said that she played music and smoked a cigarette to drown out the sounds of the schoolgirl's body jolting. The cruelty was incomprehensible. Benkired didn't just take Lola's life. She prolonged her suffering. She listened to music while a child died. What kind of person does that? What kind of darkness lives inside someone capable of such calculated horror? On October 17, 2022, 24-year-old Dahbia Benkired was indicted on charges of intentional harm of a minor under 15, inappropriate assault with physical harm, and acts of extreme cruelty. The trial wouldn't begin for nearly 3 years. After her indictment, she was held in isolation at Frane's prison. During that time, psychiatric experts evaluated her. Psychologists found nothing in her personality that would suggest a disorder, which they said was immensely frustrating. She wasn't insane. She knew exactly what she was doing. During the week-long trial, the jury heard brutal accounts of what Benkired did to Daviet, but received no clarity on why she did it. There was no explanation, no motive that made sense, just senseless violence against an innocent child. I asked for forgiveness. What I did is horrible, were the only words that Benkired said to the courtroom in her final statement on Friday. She had remained expressionless and motionless throughout the hearings, with her gaze fixated on whoever had the floor. The court, on October 24, 2025, sentenced her to life in prison without parole for raping and murdering Lola Daviet. This sentence is known in France as reclusion criminelle, à perpetuité incompressible, or perpetuité réelle. Benkired is the first woman in France to receive this sentence since it was introduced into French law in 1994, to which only 4 other criminals have been sentenced, all of them men. The harshest punishment French law allows. No parole, no second chances. Justice, at least in the legal sense, that Lola's mother and brother embraced and broke down in tears as the verdict was read. In a statement after the killer was sentenced, Lola Daviet's brother thanked the French justice system for the sentencing of Benkired, saying that his family was happy with the response we received. The victim's mother added that this was the case even if it won't give us back our Lola. Lola's father died in 2024 following his daughter's passing. Devastated by his daughter's fate, Lola's father fell into drinking problems, separated from his wife. lost his job, and died of health complications less than 2 years before the trial, on February 23, 2024, in Fookerville at the age of 49. Benkired didn't just take one life. She destroyed an entire family. This case forces France to confront uncomfortable truths. How did Benkired remain in the country despite a deportation order? Could Lola have been saved if immigration enforcement had functioned properly? These questions matter, but they shouldn't overshadow the central tragedy. A 12-year-old girl is gone. Her father couldn't survive the grief. Her mother and brother carry scars that will never heal. And somewhere in a French prison, Dahbia Benkired will spend the rest of her life paying for 90 minutes of unimaginable evil. Case for Haitian Lee grief has many faces. Some people find strength in community. Others withdraw into silence. A rare few transform pain into purpose, building foundations or charities in honor of those they've lost. But what happens when grief becomes so consuming that reality itself begins to fracture? When the unbearable weight of loss leads not to healing, but to horror? In Auckland, New Zealand, the answer to that question remained hidden inside 2 peach-colored suitcases for 4 years. And when the truth finally emerged, the world recoiled. In August 2022, an unsuspecting family bought a trailer load of items, including suitcases, at an auction for abandoned goods near Auckland. Storage units are auctioned regularly when rent goes unpaid. Most contain forgotten furniture, old clothes, worthless clutter. But when this family opened the suitcases they'd purchased, they discovered something no one could have prepared for. The pair were found in separate peach-colored suitcases, wrapped in plastic. Inside were the remains of 2 children. Lee was charged with killing Minu Joe, 6, and Yuna Joe, 8, in June 2018. The children had been dead for 4 years. Police used DNA and other forensic evidence to piece together who the children were, how long they had been dead, and ultimately who had taken their lives. The investigation led them to a New Zealand citizen named Hae-Kyung Lee, who had been born in South Korea. She went by the name Ji-eun Lee previously, but by the time authorities identified her, she was no longer in the country. Lee, who is a New Zealand citizen, had traveled to South Korea and changed her name in 2018, shortly after the children are believed to have been taken from this world. She fled to South Korea after the incidents, where she changed her name. She had vanished into her homeland, assuming she would never be found. She was wronged. On August 22, 2022, New Zealand police confirmed that they were aware that the children's mother had returned to South Korea in 2018. On September 15, 2022, the arrest of the children's mother in Ulsan, South Korea, was announced. Lee, who had long since changed her name and fled the country for her native South Korea, was eventually tracked down and arrested in the port city of Ulsan. New Zealand authorities commenced extradition proceedings through the South Korean court system. In November 2022, the South Korean Minister of Justice Han Dong-hoon approved the suspect's extradition. Earlier, the Seoul High Court had approved the woman's extradition after she had granted written consent. On November 29th, the children's mother was extradited by South Korean authorities, who also submitted significant pieces of evidence to their New Zealand counterparts. Lee, 45, was extradited from South Korea in November 2022. The trial was originally scheduled for April 2024, but for undisclosed legal reasons was postponed to September 8, 2025. When proceedings finally began, Lee pleaded not guilty to 2 intentional harm charges at the Auckland High Court. Justice Jeffrey Venning indicated that she would raise an insanity defense. Lee represented herself during the trial, supported by 2 lawyers. The children were taken from this world 7 months after Lee's husband died from cancer. That detail is critical. Lee wasn't just grieving, she was drowning. Lee's standby lawyer, Lorraine Smith, had argued that the passing of Lee's husband had led to a deep descent into insanity and the harm that befell her children. On September 9th, trial proceedings opened with both the Crown and defense delivering their opening addresses. Walker told the court that a toxicology test of the remains of Yuna and Minu Joe had concluded that the children had passed by intentional means associated with an antidepressant substance. Walker also told the court that Lee had been prescribed 60 nortriptyline tablets in August 2017 after telling her doctor that she was struggling with sleeping difficulties. She had access to medication. She knew what it could do. Crown prosecutor Natalie Walker said that Lee's actions after the incidents were calculated, and she knew what she was doing. The trial hinged not on whether Lee had taken her children's lives, which she had confessed to, but whether she knew her actions were morally wrong. In New Zealand, A successful insanity defense requires a person accused of serious harm to prove they were incapable of understanding what they were doing or that it was wrong. The jury would have to decide, was Lee insane, or was she criminally responsible? The verdict was handed down just hours after jurors were sent to deliberate behind closed doors on Tuesday. Following a 2-week trial, Lee was found guilty on September 23, 2025. The jury rejected the insanity defense. They believed Lee understood exactly what she was doing when she ended her children's lives, wrapped their bodies in plastic, stuffed them into suitcases, and locked them away in a storage unit. She was sentenced to life imprisonment on November 26, 2025. Judge Jeffrey Venning rejected calls by Lee's lawyers for a lesser penalty, sentencing the 45-year-old to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. However, the judge told Lee that while she was undoubtedly experiencing severe depression when she harmed the children in 2018, her actions were deliberate and calculated. Justice Jeffrey Venning told Haekyung Lee at the High Court hearing in the city of Auckland that she would begin her sentence as a patient in a locked psychiatric facility under New Zealand's compulsory mental health treatment law. Lee must return to prison when she is well enough. You could not cope when your husband became seriously unwell, and perhaps you could not bear to have the children around you as a constant reminder of your former happy life, which had been cruelly taken from you. The judge said. That statement reveals the tragedy at the heart of this case. Minu and Yuna weren't just victims of their mother's grief. They were reminders of what she'd lost. Their father, their intact family, their happiness. And in Lee's fractured mind, eliminating that reminder seemed like the only solution. But it wasn't insanity. It was calculated. Cold. Wrong. Lee's lawyers on Wednesday argued for a reduced sentence because of her mental illness, saying their client felt shame for her actions and had been isolated and threatened in custody. But shame doesn't bring Minu and Yuna back. Regret doesn't undo 4 years of their bodies hidden in darkness. 17 years before parole eligibility seems like justice on paper, but it feels hollow when weighed against 2 lives that never got to begin. New Zealand will never forget the suitcase case. It forces uncomfortable questions about mental health support, about how we identify struggling parents, about whether grief counseling could have changed the outcome. But ultimately, this case is about 2 children who deserve better. Minu and Yuna Jo should be teenagers now. They should be learning, growing, living. Instead, they're statistics in one of New Zealand's most disturbing criminal cases. Their mother will spend decades in prison. But for Minu and Yuna, there are no second chances. Their story ended in 2 peach-colored suitcases, and nothing will ever make that right. Case 5. Jamie Michelle Bradley Brunn. Every parent knows the sound of their child's voice. The particular pitch when they're excited. The tone when they're afraid. The cadence when they're calling for help. But what happens when a voice calling for help is silenced by the very person who should answer it? When protection becomes predation. When a mother's arms, meant to comfort, become instruments of harm. On St. Helena Island, South Carolina, in the early hours of May 19, 2023, those questions stopped being theoretical and became horrifyingly real. At approximately 1:25 in the morning, the Beaufort County Sheriff's Office responded to a home on Sam Doyle Drive. The call was frantic, desperate. A 16-year-old girl called 911 saying that her mother was trying to end her sister's life. Deputies arrived within 8 minutes. Jamie Michelle Bradley Brunn, 37, was detained at the scene. When investigators arrived, they detained Brunn and later found the body of her 6-year-old daughter, Micaiah Bradley Brunn. An autopsy performed by the Beaufort County Coroner's Office on Friday confirmed the 6-year-old's cause of passing was drowning. But Micaiah wasn't the only victim that night. Following that, Bradley Brunn then attempted to drown an 8-year-old child. A plea for help from the 8-year-old woke others in the home who were able to intervene and call 911 for help. The 16-year-old sister had been asleep when screams pierced the darkness. Sheriff Tanner said the 16-year-old was woken up by the screams of her 8-year-old sister calling for help. He said the 16-year-old was able to take the 8-year-old to safety in a nearby family residence. That teenage girl saved a life that night. She acted while others might have frozen. She intervened when intervention meant confronting her own mother. Beaufort County Sheriff P.J. Tanner, who has been in law enforcement in Beaufort County for 43 years, called what happened horrific. Typically, mothers do not harm their children, he said during a press conference. This is not a typical situation. The details that emerged painted a picture of calculated violence. Deputy Solicitor Mary Jones said the incident happened shortly after midnight on May 19th, 2023. Bradley Brunn told her youngest daughter, Micaiah, to remove her clothes, put on what police described as a funeral dress, get into a bathtub filled with water, and get on her knees, a funeral dress. Let that image sink in. Bradley Brunn wasn't acting on impulse. She dressed her daughter for her own burial before taking her life. As the child resisted, Bradley Brunn, 40, grabbed her by the hair and forced her under the water until she drowned, before turning her attention to her older daughter and trying to repeat the attack. Micaiah fought. She resisted, but a 6-year-old is no match for an adult determined to harm. After ending the child's life, authorities said Bradley Brunn placed her daughter's body on a bed and dressed her in what was described as a funeral dress. The prosecution would later emphasize this detail. It showed planning, deliberation, consciousness of what she was doing. This wasn't a mental health crisis that erupted without warning. This was intentional. The case dragged on for more than 2 years. Jamie Michelle Bradley Brunn, 40, pleaded guilty to intentional harm and attempted harm in the May 2023 attack inside the family's home on St. Helena Island in Beaufort County. The plea came in December 2025. Bradley Brunn's guilty plea spared the surviving children from having to testify at trial. They wouldn't have to relive the horror on a witness stand. They wouldn't have to describe in detail how their mother tried to take their lives. But the prosecution made sure the facts were clear. Deputy Solicitor Mary Jones explained this wasn't an accident or a mental health crisis, and that Bradley Brunn planned it. Despite claims that substance issues and other factors were responsible for her actions, Bradley Brunn was found competent, the solicitor added. She held her daughter under the water and tried to do the same to her middle daughter. There is no excuse that no excuse. Those words matter. Poverty isn't an excuse. Stress isn't an excuse. Even genuine mental illness, if someone remains legally competent, isn't an excuse to harm children. The law recognizes that some lines cannot be crossed, regardless of circumstances. Bradley Brunn was sentenced to 50 years in prison for the intentional harm of her younger daughter and a concurrent 30-year sentence for attempting to end her 8-year-old daughter's life. Prosecutors said the sentences ensure she will spend the remainder of her life in prison. 50 years. Micaiah lived for 6. Bradley Brunn will die behind bars, assuming she serves her full sentence. Is that justice? For Micaiah, nothing will ever be enough. She's gone. Her potential, her future, her life, all erased in a bathtub on St. Helena Island while wearing a dress meant for her funeral. But for the survivors, perhaps there's some measure of peace knowing their mother can never hurt them again. In May of the same year. After the incident, more than 50 people gathered on St. Helena Island to honor the life of Micaiah Bradley Brunn, who was taken earlier that month, and to support her family in the wake of the tragedy. The vigil took place at the Gullah Way Tutorial Center, where family members, friends, and community residents shared memories and reflections about the youngster's bright spirit and presence in the community. Bright spirit. That's how people remembered her. Not as a victim, not as a statistic, as a child who should still be here. The 16-year-old daughter who saved her sister's life that night deserves recognition. Sheriff Tanner said, "I think she did an unbelievable job. She defended her family when no one else was available to do so until we got there. Her courage is amazing. Courage. At 16, facing a situation no child should ever face, she acted. She protected. She survived. But survival comes with a cost. Trauma doesn't disappear with a guilty verdict. Therapy helps. Time helps. But the memory of that night, of her mother's actions, of her sister's screams, will never fully fade. This case forces South Carolina to ask uncomfortable questions. Were there warning signs? Did anyone notice Bradley Brunn struggling? Could intervention have saved Micaiah? The answers matter because child protection is a community responsibility. Teachers, neighbors, friends, family all have a role to play in noticing when something is wrong. But ultimately, this case is about a 6-year-old girl who trusted her mother and paid with her life. Micaiah Bradley Brunn deserved better. She deserved safety. She deserved childhood. She deserved to grow up. Instead, she's a memory, a name on a headstone, a case file in a courthouse, and somewhere in a South Carolina prison, the woman who should have protected her will spend the rest of her life answering for that night. Dallas Humber terror doesn't always announce itself with a bomb vest or a manifesto nailed to a door. Sometimes it hides behind a computer screen in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Sometimes it operates through encrypted messages in chat rooms most people have never heard of. And sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who never fires a shot but convinces others to pull the trigger. In Elk Grove, California. A 35-year-old woman sat in the comfort of her home and orchestrated violence across continents. Her weapon wasn't a gun. It was influence. Dallas Humber, 35, of Elk Grove, California, leader of the Telegram Collective, a transnational terrorist group, was sentenced to 360 months in prison for soliciting hate crimes, soliciting the intentional harm of federal officials, and conspiring to provide material support to terrorists. The sentence was handed down on December 17, 2025 by U.S. District Judge Gina Emmanuel. 30 years. It's the harshest sentence the federal government could secure under the plea agreement. But considering what Humber orchestrated, some argued it wasn't nearly enough. From July 2022 until her arrest in September 2024, Humber served as a leader of the Telegram Collective, a white supremacist transnational terrorist group. The name comes from Telegram, the encrypted messaging platform where the group primarily operated. According to the Anti-Defamation League, the group was a network of white supremacists and neo-Nazis who wanted to incite a race war and accelerate the collapse of society. Accelerationism. That's the ideology. The belief that society must be destroyed through violence, so something new can rise from the ashes. Humber didn't just believe this philosophy. She made it her mission to recruit others to carry it out to achieve their ends. Humber and other members of the Telegram Collective solicited individuals to commit hate crimes, terrorist attacks on critical infrastructure, and assassinations, and provided technical, inspirational, and operational guidance to equip those individuals to plan, prepare for, and successfully carry out those attacks. Technical guidance. That means bomb-making instructions, target selection, operational security, how to avoid detection, how to maximize casualties. Humber wasn't just cheerleading violence. She was teaching it. The body count speaks for itself. Individuals led by Humber and the Telegram Collective committed acts of violence internationally, including an incident that harmed 3 people and took 2 lives at an LGBT bar in Bratislava, Slovakia, an incident that harmed 11 people and took 4 lives at 2 schools in Veracruz, Brazil, and an incident that harmed 5 people outside of a mosque in Eskişehir, Turkey. Those weren't random acts. They were calculated attacks against specific communities. LGBTQ people, students, Muslims, anyone Humber and her followers deemed unworthy of life. And domestically, the plots were just as chilling. Inspired and guided by Humber and the Telegram Collective, individuals committed attacks or plotted to commit attacks in the United States and elsewhere, including plotting to attack an energy facility in New Jersey, plotting to bomb an energy facility in Tennessee, plotting to harm 2 people in Wisconsin in furtherance of plans to target a federal official, and attempting to target an Australian official. Energy infrastructure. The goal was clear. Create chaos. Destabilize society. Force collapse. In March 2023, Dallas Humber was found to be the narrator of the Telegram videos. The Telegram belief system recalls that of extreme ideologues. Its members celebrate saints, individuals who passed while carrying out attacks against people of color and LGBTQ people, an ethos used to inspire future attacks. In a Telegram post in 2022, Humber explained that the canonization of individuals who committed harm and amplification of their messages creates an environment where aspiring individuals are increasingly willing to perpetrate violence as a way to honor previous saints, attain sainthood themselves, and inspire future attacks. She understood the psychology of radicalization, and she weaponized it. On September 9, 2024, U.S. prosecutors in California charged Dallas Humber, 34, and Matthew Robert Allison, 37, accused of leading the Telegram network with soliciting hate crimes, soliciting the intentional harm of federal officials, and conspiring to provide material support to terrorists. The FBI had been watching, building a case, waiting for the right moment. When they finally moved, the evidence was overwhelming. In August 2025, Humber pleaded guilty to all charges against her, including soliciting hate crimes, soliciting the intentional harm of federal officials, and conspiring to provide material support to terrorists. The plea agreement contemplated a sentence of 25 to 30 years in prison. She avoided trial. She avoided the possibility of life in prison. But she couldn't avoid accountability. From the comfort of her suburban California home, Humber used online platforms to celebrate violence and solicit attacks that took the lives of innocent people and injured others around the world. Her incarceration makes the world a safer place, said Assistant Attorney General for National Security John A. Eisenberg. Humber actively encouraged violence against and the intentional harm of individuals based on their race, religion, orientation, and gender identity. U.S. Attorney Eric Grant for the Eastern District of California said in a statement that in January 2025, the State Department designated the Telegram Collective and 3 of its members as specially designated global terrorists. The Australian Foreign Affairs Minister, Penny Wong, stated on February 2, 2025, that terrorism sanctions have been placed on the Telegram network. On June 27, 2025, Telegram was officially listed as a terrorist organization in Australia. On December 10, 2025, the Telegram Collective was designated as a terror group by Canada and New Zealand. The world finally recognized what investigators had known for years. This wasn't just online trolling. This was organized terrorism. U.S. District Judge Dina Coggins also ordered lifetime supervised release for Humber's convictions. Even when she's released at 65 years old, assuming she serves her full sentence, she'll never truly be free. Monitored, restricted, watched for the rest of her life. But what about the people she influenced who haven't been caught yet? What about the next generation of extremists consuming Telegram content right now? Humber's arrest didn't eliminate the ideology. Institute for Strategic Dialogue described the collective as effectively defunct in 2024 due to arrests of key figures. Effectively defunct. Not completely. Not permanently. Just weakened. This case forces uncomfortable questions about the internet's role in radicalization. How do we balance free speech with public safety? How do we identify potential terrorists before they act? And how many people like Humber are operating right now, sitting in suburban homes, typing messages that will result in violence thousands of miles away? The answers matter because Dallas Humber proves something terrifying. You don't need weapons to be dangerous. You don't need training. You just need an internet connection and the willingness to inspire others to commit atrocities. Humber will spend decades in prison. But the ideology she spread? That's harder to eliminate. And somewhere, someone might already be filling the void she left behind. Case 7 Myong Jaewon schools are supposed to be sanctuaries. Places where children learn, play, discover who they are and who they might become. Parents drop their kids off in the morning with the absolute certainty they'll pick them up in the afternoon. That social contract, that fundamental trust, is what holds societies together. But on February 10th, 2025, in Daejeon, South Korea, that contract was shattered in the most unimaginable way. And the person who broke, it wasn't a stranger who breached security. It was someone the children called teacher. Kim Han-ul was 8 years old. She was a first grader at an elementary school in western Daejeon, attending an after-school care program that Monday afternoon. Her father would later reveal that she was a huge fan of the K-pop girl group IVE, particularly member Jang Won-young, and dreamed of becoming a singer, just like her idol. She had her whole life ahead of her. Dreams. Potential. A future that should have stretched for decades. Instead, it ended in an audiovisual room on the second floor of her school. Around 5 in the afternoon, after classes had ended, Myong Jaewon, a 48-year-old teacher at the school, lured Kim into the audiovisual room with a promise. She told the little girl she would give her a book. Kim, trusting the adult authority figure in her life, followed. She had no reason to be afraid. This was her teacher. This was her school. These were the people and places designed to keep her safe. But safety, it turns out, is an illusion when the threat comes from within. Myong stabbed Kim to death with a knife she had prepared in advance. The attack was brutal. Kim suffered multiple stab wounds to her face, neck, and shoulders. When school staff discovered them, both Kim and Myong were bleeding. Myong had inflicted injuries on her own neck and arm, self-inflicted wounds meant to suggest what? A struggle? A suicide attempt? Both were rushed to the hospital, but Kim was pronounced dead upon arrival. Myong survived and would later confess to the crime. The confession shocked investigators almost as much as the crime itself. Myong admitted that she purchased the weapon on the day of the attack and brought it to school. She told police she randomly chose Kim because she was the last student leaving the after-school program. Not targeted, not personal, just convenient. She also revealed that she had planned to take her own life along with a child, though she never explained why Kim had to die too. Why any child had to die. The investigation uncovered disturbing patterns. Myong had been suffering from depression since 2018. In December 2024, she requested a 6-month leave due to her mental health struggles. A doctor evaluated her and deemed her fit to continue working, so she returned to the classroom 20 days later. During her time off, She had lingering thoughts of self-harm. But more troubling were her actions in the days immediately before the attack. She displayed violent behavior, including putting another teacher in a headlock. She kicked and damaged a school computer. She assaulted a colleague. These weren't subtle warning signs. These were alarms that no one properly heard. Forensic analysis of Myong's phone, personal computer, and three-word computers revealed that she had researched murder articles and weaponry before the attack. Police confirmed it was a premeditated crime. She knew what she was planning. She prepared. She executed. And when questioned about motive, she told police she was annoyed at being excluded from teaching a class just 3 days after returning to work. Annoyed. That was her explanation. A workplace grievance, and she took it out on an 8-year-old child who had nothing to do with her frustration. The case went to trial in October 2025. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, citing the act on the aggravated punishment of specific crimes, under which taking the life of a minor under 13 after abduction or enticement is punishable by either life imprisonment or capital punishment. They emphasized multiple aggravating factors, including the absence of genuine remorse on Myong's part and the victim's family's wish for the harshest punishment possible. Myong made an apology in court, but her words rang hollow. On October 20th, 2025, the Daejeon District Court sentenced Myong to life in prison. The court also ordered her to wear an electronic tracking device for 30 years after her release, assuming she ever becomes eligible for parole. The judge's words captured the horror of what happened. The pain and fear felt by the 7-year-old victim, who was killed in what should have been the safest place, and the grief of her family are beyond what the court can measure. Both the prosecution and defense appealed. Prosecutors wanted the death penalty. The defense argued for diminished responsibility and a lighter sentence. On January 16, 2026, the Daejeon High Court dismissed both appeals and upheld Myong's murder conviction and life sentence. The decision was final. Kim Han-ul's funeral took place at Kanyang University Hospital's funeral hall. Her parents, relatives, school teachers, and many others attended. Local residents left gifts of chrysanthemums, dolls, and sweets outside the school gate. The K-pop group IVE, whose music Kim loved, sent a flower wreath as condolence. After cremation, Kim's ashes were buried at Daejeon Memorial Park on February 14, 2025. 4 days after her death. 4 days after she should have been in school, learning and laughing. Acting President Choi Sang-mok attended the funeral and offered condolences during a cabinet meeting. He directed the Education Ministry and authorities to conduct a thorough investigation. Impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol also offered condolences, expressing hope that measures could prevent similar tragedies. Multiple law revisions were proposed to prevent teachers with severe mental illnesses from teaching at schools without proper oversight. But laws can't bring Kim Han-ul back. Reforms can't undo what happened in that audiovisual room. And parents across South Korea, watching this case unfold, realized their worst nightmare was possible. The person entrusted to protect their children could be the one who harms them. That knowledge changes everything. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. Myong Jaewon will spend the rest of her life in prison. She'll wear an electronic monitor for 30 years if she's ever released. She'll never teach again. She'll never be free. But Kim Han-ul will never sing like Jang Won-young. She'll never grow up. She'll never chase her dreams. Her story ended at 8 years old, in a place that should have been safe at the hands of someone who should have protected her. And that, more than any sentence, is the true tragedy of this case. Case 8 Carrie Jones' neighbors are supposed to coexist peacefully. Maybe they're not friends. Maybe they don't share meals or exchange Christmas cards. But there's an unspoken agreement in small towns everywhere. You respect boundaries. You wave when passing. You help during emergencies. You certainly don't encourage your husband to commit mass violence. But in Laurel, Nebraska, population under 1,000, where everyone knows everyone, that fundamental social contract was shattered on August 4th, 2022. And when the smoke cleared from 2 burning homes, 4 people were dead and a community was traumatized forever. Gene Twyford was 86 years old. He was a veteran and a former Nebraska statewide commander of the American Legion. His daughter described him as a jokester who embraced life and never understood why people chose to be angry at the world when life had so much good to offer. His wife, Janet, was 85. She was the most organized person in the family, always baking treats, remembering every birthday, making everyone feel loved. Their daughter, Dana, 55, lived with them because she had special needs. She had worked in a nursing home and was beloved in the community. 2 blocks away lived Michelle Ebeling, 53, a neighbor who had no connection to whatever grievances were brewing in the mind of Carrie Jones. Carrie Jones, 46, lived on Elm Street in Laurel with her husband, Jason. She claimed that Gene Twyford had been making inappropriate comments to her for years. Whether those comments actually happened or existed only in her imagination remains unclear. But what is clear is that Carrie became fixated on the elderly veteran, angry, obsessed, and instead of handling the situation like an adult, talking to Twyford directly, reporting him to authorities, or simply avoiding him, she decided Gene Twyford needed to die. The prosecution would later argue that Carrie encouraged her husband to confront Twyford. Text messages between the couple leading up to the incident showed a pattern. Words of encouragement, anger, plans forming in the digital space between 2 phones. And on the night of August 4th, 2022, those words turned into action. Jason Jones, 45, entered the Twyford home using a pry bar. He shot and killed Gene Twyford. But Gene wasn't alone. His wife Janet and daughter Dana were also home. Jason killed them too. Then he walked down the street to Michelle Ebeling's home and shot her dead before setting both houses on fire. Neighbors heard an explosion at the Ebeling residence in the early morning hours. When they rushed outside, they were surprised to see Carrie and Jason Jones standing outside the burning home. Carrie didn't seem to acknowledge her husband at first, but later claimed Jason was trying to help when he saw the fire. She was performing, playing the role of concerned neighbor while knowing exactly what her husband had done. Laurel Police Chief Ron Lundahl interviewed Carrie on her porch that morning. She talked about being at the fire scene, but Lundahl had no idea that Jason was inside their house at that very moment, suffering from massive third-degree burns. He had set himself on fire while torching the homes. Shortly after the interview, firefighters discovered the second crime scene at the Twyford home. Smoke was pouring from the house. Inside were 3 bodies. The Nebraska State Patrol SWAT team surrounded the Jones home. They spent 3 hours preparing to storm the residence. An officer called Carrie as she was driving, hoping she could get Jason to answer his phone. In the recorded call, the jury would later hear Carrie tell the officer that he wouldn't answer. She knew he was injured. She knew what he'd done, and she was already working to protect him. Jason Jones was eventually carried out of his home, with significant burns covering much of his body. He was transferred to a Lincoln hospital for treatment. Carrie Jones continued living in their Laurel home from the time of the incidents until she was arrested on December 16, 2022. For 4 months, she went about her daily life in a town devastated by the violence her husband had committed at her encouragement. Gail Curry, daughter of Gene and Janet Twyford, would later describe the agony of that waiting period. Carrie never came forward, never showed an ounce of remorse, never once said she was sorry. On the day of the funeral for Gail's mother, father, and sister, Carrie chose to mow her lawn right across from one of the churches holding the services, as if nothing had happened. Jason Jones was tried first. His trial took place for 10 days in Dakota County, starting on September 9, 2024. The trial was moved out of Cedar County because it would be impossible to select an impartial jury in such a small, close-knit community. After more than 7 hours of deliberation, a jury convicted Jason Jones on 12 charges, including 4 counts of first-degree murder for weapons counts and 2 counts of arson. He awaits sentencing, with prosecutors seeking the death penalty. Carrie Jones' trial began on July 28, 2025, in Madison County. Her trial was also moved for the same reasons. The prosecution argued that even though Jason Jones was the one who pulled the trigger, a combination of Carrie's text messages to her husband leading up to the incidents, coupled with her actions and interviews afterwards, was enough to prove that she encouraged Jason to carry out the violence. Consider things not in isolation. Prosecutors urged the jury, but consider Carrie Jones' words and acts in totality, in combination with one another. The defense tried to clear Carrie with testimony from Jason himself. On August 6, 2025, Jason was called to the stand. He insisted Carrie had nothing to do with the crimes. When asked directly if Carrie Jones had ever asked him to kill anyone, he said no. But the jury didn't believe him. They saw through the attempt to protect his wife. On August 7, 2025, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Carrie Jones guilty of first-degree murder, evidence tampering, and being an accessory to a felony. Under Nebraska law, Carrie's first-degree murder conviction meant she faced a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. On November 20, 2025, Cedar County District Court Judge Brian Meismer formally sentenced her. In court, Prosecutor Sandra Allen addressed the senselessness of it all. If you had a problem with Mr. Twyford, go talk to the man. That could resolve the problem short of killing his entire family. Go have a talk with the man. Find out he is a harmless old man. It didn't have to end like this. Gail Curry spoke at sentencing. She talked about her father's love of life, her mother's warmth, her sister Dana's heroism. Dana had surprised Jason Jones during the attack, throwing off his plan and forcing him into mistakes that led to his arrest. Even in her final moments, Dana was trying to save her family. Carrie Jones showed little emotion as she was led from the courtroom. There were tears from spectators who had ties to the victims. Laurel, Nebraska, went more than a century without seeing such violence. Now, 2 vacant lots sit where the Twyford and Ebeling homes once stood. Demolished. Empty. Reminders of what was lost. The community has climbed back. Children walk down the road again. People are at ease. But it will never be fully normal. Not when 4 people died because a woman couldn't handle a neighbor dispute like an adult. Not when manipulation and encouragement led to mass violence. Carrie Jones will spend the rest of her life in prison. But for Jean, Janet, Dana, and Michelle, there are no second chances. Their stories ended because Carrie Jones decided they should. And that, more than any sentence, is the true tragedy. Case 9. Michelle Hilliard. There are homes where childhood should bloom. Laughter. Safety. The promise of tomorrow. But some homes become crime scenes, where trust dies long before innocence does. In Columbus, Ohio, a small child learned this truth in the cruelest way possible. And when justice finally came, it arrived too late for the boy who never got to turn 5. Michelle Hilliard was 52 years old when she stood before a Franklin County jury in September of 2025. By then, she had lived through decades of choices that led her further and further from any recognizable sense of humanity. She was a mother of 10 children. Not one of them remained in her custody. Not one. The state had removed every single child years earlier, and for reasons that would make any decent person's stomach turn. But before the courtroom drama, before the verdict, before the sentencing, there was a little boy named Bryson Brown. He was 4 years old. He was dating Michelle Hilliard's boyfriend's son. And on May 26, 2021, his short life ended in a way that still makes hardened investigators pause. That morning, just after 5 o'clock, Columbus police rushed to the 1,000 block of Gears Avenue in the Driving Park neighborhood on the city's east side. Someone had called 911. A child wasn't breathing. When first responders arrived, they found Bryson in Michelle Hilliard's arms, limp and unresponsive. His father, Hilliard's boyfriend, had discovered him in bed just moments before. The story they were told seemed straightforward at first. The boy had fallen down the stairs. Kids fall. Accidents happen. But medical examiners don't confuse accidents with intentional harm. And what they found on Bryson's tiny body told a story far darker than any fall could explain. The child had suffered multiple blunt force trauma injuries. Not one, not two, multiple. His small frame bore the evidence of repeated, deliberate strikes. Within days, the investigation shifted. Police began asking harder questions. Witnesses came forward. Text messages surfaced. And then Michelle Hilliard herself began to talk. In her own words, captured in digital messages that would later be presented in court, she admitted to striking Bryson multiple times with a board. She said the impacts caused him to tumble down the stairs. After he fell, she placed him in bed next to her boyfriend. She didn't call for help. She didn't rush him to a hospital. She laid him down and waited. Hours passed before his father found him. By then, it was too late. Bryson was taken to Nationwide Children's Hospital, but the damage was too severe. He died from his injuries. How does someone do that to a child? How does a person stand over a 4-year-old and swing a board again and again? These are the questions juries wrestle with, the questions that keep prosecutors awake at night, the questions that communities never fully answer. But Michelle Hilliard's history offered some disturbing context. This wasn't her first encounter with the criminal justice system. This wasn't even her first time hurting a child. Back in 2004, she and her late husband James were convicted on charges related to harming 2 of their own children. She served prison time. She was supposed to learn. She was supposed to change. Instead, she went on to violate sex offender registration requirements in 2018 and found herself behind bars again. And still, after all that, she was allowed around children. She was in a relationship. She had access to a vulnerable little boy, and she took his life. The trial began on September 8, 2025, in Franklin County Common Pleas Court. Prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically. The text messages, the witness statements, the medical examiner's findings. The defense tried to introduce Michelle's documented history of mental health struggles, issues that reportedly dated back to when she was 7 years old. Her attorney argued that she had attempted self-harm repeatedly over the years and suffered from significant psychological problems. The judge, Andy Miller, acknowledged these factors. He said they played a role in his decision not to impose the harshest possible sentence. But he also noted the severity of Bryson's injuries. In his own words, this was a savage attack on a 4-year-old child. On September 12th, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty of aggravated murder. Guilty of murder. Guilty of felonious assault. Guilty of endangering children. 11 days later, on September 23, 2025, Judge Miller sentenced Michelle Hilliard to 25 years to life in prison. She was given credit for the more than 1,500 days she had already spent in jail awaiting trial. She won't be eligible for parole until she's served a quarter-century behind bars. By then, she'll be in her late 70s. Bryson's father did not attend the sentencing. Prosecutors said they were unable to reach him. Michelle Hilliard's case raises uncomfortable questions about systems that fail. How did someone with her history remain free? How did she gain access to another child after everything she'd done before? And how many warning signs were ignored before Bryson Brown paid the ultimate price? The answers matter, because somewhere, right now, another vulnerable child might be one ignored red flag away from tragedy. Case 10, Kimora Hodges. Friendship can be a deceptive mask. Behind smiles and neighborly favors, darkness sometimes waits. In Roseville, Michigan, a young mother learned this lesson in the most devastating way imaginable when she entrusted her baby boy to someone she thought she knew. What began as a simple babysitting arrangement ended with a text message, a lie about soap, and a child who would never see his second birthday. Taylor Starks was just 18 years old when she became a mother. She had Kyrie when she was 16, and the two of them have been navigating life together ever since. She worked at a restaurant in East Point to make ends meet, and like so many young mothers, she needed help. When Kimora Lawmai Hodges, her upstairs neighbor, offered to watch Kyrie while Starks worked, it seemed like a blessing. Hodges was 21 at the time. She lived in the same apartment complex on Little Mac Avenue near 13th Mile Road. She had watched Kyrie multiple times before. She was a friend. She was trusted. And on the night of June 13th, 2022, that trust cost a little boy his life. Starks left for her shift that evening believing her son was safe. Hodges had been babysitting Kyrie for weeks without incident. But sometime around 10 o'clock that night, things changed. Text messages recovered from Hodges' phone showed her growing increasingly frustrated with the toddler. She complained about his behavior. She told Starks he was being sneaky. She said Starks was too soft on him. She said she didn't want to babysit him anymore. Then the messages stopped. Hours passed, and at 1:50 in the morning on June 14th, Hodges finally contacted Starks again. But this time, she wasn't complaining. She was lying. Hodges sent Starks a picture of Kyrie. She said he had eaten a piece of soap and was having an allergic reaction. Starks rushed home immediately. When she walked through the door, she found her baby on the ground. He wasn't having an allergic reaction. He was seizing, over and over, his small body convulsing uncontrollably. Starks called 911. Paramedics rushed Kyrie to Ascension St. John Hospital, and it was there that doctors delivered the news that shattered any belief in the soap story. Kyrie had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. He was bleeding from his ears. He needed emergency brain surgery just to stay alive. The medical findings were undeniable. Kyrie had a subdural hemorrhage. He had bilateral retinal hemorrhages. These were not injuries caused by eating soap or falling or any innocent accident. These were the kinds of injuries seen in cases of severe abuse. Police arrested Hodges shortly after Kyrie was admitted to the hospital. And when detectives questioned her, she began to crack. She told them, "Maybe I hit him too hard, but I didn't take my anger out on him." She also said, "That's not what was supposed to happen." According to Starks and investigators, Hodges had thrown Kyrie into a wall and shaken him violently. And those were just some of the things she did to him. For nearly a week, Kyrie clung to life in the hospital. He had no brain activity. His tiny body was being kept alive by machines. Starks sat beside him, helpless, watching her son slip away. On June 15th, 2022, just 2 days after the incident, Kyrie died from his injuries. He was 22 months old. He could count to 5. He had his whole life ahead of him. And Kimora Hodges had taken it all away. The legal process took over 3 years. Hodges was initially charged with first-degree child abuse. After Kyrie's passing, prosecutors added a charge of felony murder. The case was delayed because Hodges appealed a trial court ruling about statements she made to police. She argued that detectives continued questioning her after she requested an attorney. The Court of Appeals ultimately ruled that one statement had to be suppressed, but the other could be used at trial. In July of 2025, after a 6-day trial, a Macomb County jury heard all the evidence. They deliberated for just 2 hours before returning their verdict. Guilty of felony murder. Guilty of first-degree child abuse. On November 4, 2025, Macomb County Circuit Judge Diane Drzezinski handed down the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder charge. An additional 15 to 40 years for the child abuse charge. Kimora Hodges, now 24 years old, will never walk free again. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars for what she did to a defenseless toddler. A postponed sentencing hearing in October, Taylor Stark spoke. She faced the woman who had taken her son from her. And in a moment that stunned the courtroom, she said she didn't hate Hodges. She said she wished her the best. But she also made it clear that justice needed to be served. She had tried to give Hodges grace during the legal process. She had even discussed the possibility of a plea deal that would have allowed for parole someday. But the trial revealed who Hodges truly was. And that made a life sentence not just appropriate, but necessary. Macomb County Prosecutor Peter Lucido said the sentence reflected the severity of the crime. He said the justice system has a duty to protect the most vulnerable. And on that November day, in 2025, that duty was fulfilled. But for Taylor Starks, no sentence can bring back her son. No punishment can undo the moment she walked into that apartment and found Kyrie on the floor. The question that haunts every case like this remains unanswered. How does someone entrusted with a child's safety become the one who destroys it?